Everybody, in this video we'll be discussing the Falkland Wars, or in this case, to be much more specific, it's the influence of technology in determining the outcome of the Falkland Wars, in which the British won against the Argentinians in 1982. So you probably already read the proceeds, hopefully, but in case you haven't, the Falkland Wars was essentially a war fought in 1982, nearing the end of the Cold War, in which Gorbachev has already basically been elected, in which there's essentially the small island of Falkland over here, which is right off the coast of Argentina. And so it's honestly an extremely tiny island, and it is important to note that it is a British colony. However, many years ago, back during the main colonial era, the Spaniards had declared it a part of Argentina, and so at this point, with the severe decrease in many aspects of imperialism, Argentina had decided that it should try and make a move on the Falkland Islands, which it had always believed to be a part of, that it had believed it to be rightfully theirs. And so because of that, on April, they decide to invade the Falkland Islands with a force of approximately 1,500 men, and at this point, the Falkland Islands, they only had less than 100 royal troops to defend, and so they're easily overrun, and they just simply sent a message out. As soon as they sent the message out, though, Britain responded in overwhelming force. Immediately, the current Prime Minister then, Margaret Thatcher, had decided to personally ordered that a massive fleet, well, not necessarily a massive fleet, but major fleet be disbanded and dispatched and sent off to the islands in order to take it back. And honestly, nobody was really expecting a move like this because, once again, everybody had believed that the British were in the decline. And so, moving on, though, the main parts of the fleet included the main ship, which is the HMS Invincible, along with several others, each with their own different purposes. However, the HMS would be one of the main ships involved, and they carried a massive amount of people, in which approximately, I believe, around 5,000 were the first to arrive, and these were mostly amphibious troops, which had almost been considered to be disbanded at this time because they had seen little to no use, according to the current circumstances of the war, in which Britain had believed that in the case that a war actually occurred in Europe, everything would be decided with a nuclear arsenal, because the war would essentially end before anybody could actually make amphibious invasions and such. But then in this case, they actually did find a use, though, and so the war began. And in this case, analyzing the actual technological factors, however, it is actually probably very important to note here that the entire industry of the military in which military would be selling to each other had already begun. Not only that, though, but ironically enough, the British had been selling a lot of their weapons over to the Argentinians, and the US had actually been selling a lot of their weapons over to the Argentinians as well. And so because of that, the Argentinians were actually extremely well armed, and at this point, many of the smaller countries, although they weren't necessarily rich in any way, shape, or form, they still did have enough money to purchase these weapons, meaning that they actually were not that far behind. Like, this is no longer the era in which the British would or like some colonial power would invade Africa and all they meet in resistance were natives carrying spears and such. These are people fighting against forces that not only were technologically up to par, but they're also using their own weapons against them. For example, the Argentinians had, and it used to very great effect, these two types of missiles. One would be the Sea Dart missiles, which is a surface-to-air missile that the British had quite a headache dealing with, and the British, of course, also used it against the Argentinians. And then they also had to, used the Exocet missiles to extremely well effect as well. And here we have a picture of the HMS Sheffield getting hit by an Exocet missile, and it would actually bring the ship down as well. So, yeah, in this case, like, it would somewhat be an issue of arms, and up to a certain extent, it wasn't as if the British won only because of arms, and there was actually a lot of innovation on the part of the British as well. For example, one of the most major and key factors of this entire battle due to the simple fact that this was essentially a massive amphibious invasion that also involved plenty of air battles. Was the Sea Harrier that had been developed by the Royal Air Force. And here are a couple pictures here. So the Sea Harrier, what mainly distinguished it was the fact that it had very, very good air-to-air capabilities. A single one of them had reportedly taken down approximately 20 Argentinian aircraft during some of the more major, well, as major as the battles could actually be, concerning the Falkland Islands. And they're a key part of the reason as to why the British were able to win and were able to disable a lot of the potential air support. Not only that though, however, but although it is true that the numbers factor is a major part of it, as already stated, the Argentinians sent approximately 1,500 troops, and the British responded with 5,000 amphibious troops, followed by another fleet of 3,000 amphibious troops. At the same time, though, the reason why all these troops were able to appear in this case was because of that microcomputers had already been starting to get developed up to a higher point. Of course, we're not talking about like laptops or like PCs here. We're talking about just simply devices that were probably humongous in relation to our time, that had the ability to organize things and be able to do an immense amounts of calculations that were required in order to coordinate a lot of their troops and their fleet and such. And so because of that, especially with all the communications that were going on in such a battle that was essentially taking place on the other side of the world for the British, this computational process would be extremely important. Not only that, but this would also be have massive implications in the future, because the Soviets, of course, were also keeping a close eye on this war, partially, of course, laughing at it, considering the fact that both countries involved were the U.S.'s allies, and the U.S., meanwhile, was feeling quite embarrassed about this, considering the fact that both sides were supposed to be their allies, and they're fighting over a tiny island, once again, that nobody really cared about. They're essentially just like the New Zealanders, in which their entire industry was based on herding sheep. And so, of course, the U.S. were quite embarrassed about this. But the main thing, though, is that, back on topic, the Soviet Union realized that the British, that single section of the fleet that the British sent over, had more computational and processing power than almost their entire military. The U.S.'s allies had long caught up to the Soviets' might when it came to computer technology, and this was extremely worrying for the Soviet Union, and of course the Argentinians had nothing like this. So although it is true that the British were able to overwhelm the Argentinians partially with numbers and just sheer force, it was also, of course, the fact that the sheer force was possible because of this better technology. Not only that, though, but another issue is these darling weapons, nuclear submarines. Of course, the word nuclear should tip everybody off, in which only the major countries had access to anything that was remotely nuclear related at this point. But not only that, though, however, but nuclear technology, nuclear submarines in particular, were what allowed the British to be able to declare the entire 200-mile radius around the Falkland Islands as a total exclusion zone, and these things absolutely terrified the Argentinian ships, because there was no real way to actually deal with these nuclear submarines. Of course, like, they could try and send minor torpedoes and such, but the thing is just like these nuclear submarines, they would be sending out World War II era technology torpedoes, so once again reinforcing the fact that the two sides were not that different in technology, but however, nuclear submarines were far more efficient, they were far better, and so because of that, they would roam around terrorizing Argentinian ships. Not only that, though, but interestingly enough, however, although it is true that the nuclear submarines were far superior in terms of being able to stay underwater and their speed and their efficiency and such, weirdly enough, the Argentinian submarines were actually just as effective. Well, not just as effective would be quite the best way to put it. However, they're still extremely effective, and although, of course, they weren't able to exactly shut down an entire zone of ocean like the nuclear submarines were, due to the fact that the Argentinians had several whales in their area, the British actually had no way to distinguish between whales and submarines, as the two of them both reacted in the exact same way towards anti-submarine missiles, and they also reacted in the exact same, and they also produced the exact same sort of sounds and such. And so because of that, it was extremely hard for the British to be able to determine false alarms and actual submarines, and so the submarines were actually used to great effect as well on both sides. However, in the end, though, in June, the British were still able to overwhelm the the Argentinians, mostly just simply once again through sheer force, but also because of that, they were able to attain total air supremacy. Although it is true that the air supremacy is a key part of why they were able to win the entire conflict in total, and so that's a major reason as to why the technological factor might have been a portion of it. At the same time, though, however, that air technology really wasn't that big either, in that it was also because of great support in which the British were able to release so much and they were able to dispatch so much. And so because of that, this would also be in part due to nationalism, in which the British were very determined to prove that they were not a quote unquote dying empire. And also, once again, as repeated ad nauseum, sheer force brought things through. Not only that, though, however, but the Argentinians were also under economic sanction due to this, and the Argentinians were not prepared for this war as well, because when they took over the Falkland Islands, they thought that the British would just give it up, because once again, it's a tiny sheep herding island off the coast right here.